At Nedbank CIB, we see money for the difference it can make.
So last month, the department released the much-awaited energy plan, the draft energy plan, as well as the integrated resource plan, the draft versions of that. So before we get into a bit of the reactions to the plan, can you tell us why the Department of Energy thinks the proposals outlined in the blueprint are the best way to secure South Africa's energy needs for the long term?
Maybe just to indicate that the integrated resource plan and the integrated energy plan were approved for public consultation by Cabinet about 2 weeks ago, and we are very proud of the milestone that we have achieved as a department. And that's because this is not the culmination but the beginning of a process to conclude the plan. So it's not like the plan has been completed, it's not done yet. We're in the middle of a 4-stage process, and this is only the second milestone in terms of which we're wanting to solicit public input in relation to 2 things. One is the assumptions that we've made, the type of assumptions that would allow us, to project into the future, because we could never be exact about what happens in the period from now up to 2050. So we make certain assumptions and would like to test the veracity of those assumptions. The second thing we'd like the public to comment on is in regard to the the actual scenarios that we would like to be able to model. In other words, what sort of pathway into the future do we see for our energy sector in South Africa? I should also indicate that this is actually the second process that we're following on. We had the IRP 2010, we called it, promulgated in March 2011. So this is about 4.5, 5 years since that process, and we're now embarking on an update process. And then lastly is that this is a very contested kind of process. So we really have prepared ourselves to engage the public and answer all manner of questions that might arise.
But what took so long to get the proposed energy blueprint out?
Okay, the energy blueprint, in terms of the law, we make a commitment that has to be done frequently, right? So you hear a lot of talk out there about this having to be done every 2 years, every 3 years. That's incorrect. It doesn't have to be done every 2 years or 3 years. It has to be done frequently enough. And I suppose the prudent way of approaching this is every time there are major shifts in the assumptions that we would have made, one needs to go back and revisit the plan. And I think in our South African energy context, amongst the biggest shifts have been the extent to which the energy demand that we projected back in 2009-10 has significantly changed to where we find ourselves today. I mean, you might read in the newspapers about the extent to which demand growth, insofar as electricity consumption is concerned, is flat, has been flat for the past year and a half almost, and therefore we have to recalibrate. Secondly, there's been a major shift in relation to the costs of the various technologies that we have been rolling out, as it were. So back in 2009-10, one of the big issues, and I suppose this is the point that we also need to make, is that had we not intervened in relation to the renewable energy projects and approached it technologies, and approached it on the basis that solar PV and wind are relatively expensive, we wouldn't have had such a successful rollout of renewable energy in this country. So those are the kind of things that tend to be contested. So in some instances, people would like to see their, if you like, their interests, being put above other interests, and our job is to try and find a nice trade-off.
So let's stay on the topic of renewable energy. There's general consensus that the need for coal should be less as we go into the future, especially with the carbon emissions tax looming. But there is some concerns that the draft plan underestimates renewable energy in terms of its pricing, and it underestimates the extent to which the prices of renewables will fall in the next 20 to 30 years. What's your response to this?
We're not convinced that we should reduce the extent to which you use coal necessarily. I think our stance is that one needs to reduce the extent to which coal contributes and adds to the greenhouse gas emissions, right? And I'm trying to make the point about, for example, cleaner coal technologies. So there are technologies out there that allow for the beneficiation of and use of coal, but in a manner that is not as traditional as what we used to do in the past. So we have to be careful about those kind of things, because we have perhaps hundreds of years of coal reserves in this country, and we have a very, if you like, well-established industry. There are lots of jobs that hinge on the coal sector. Insofar as renewables, we have an excellent track record insofar as the rollout of renewable energy is concerned in this country. Our renewable energy IPP program is in the top 5 in the world over the past 5 years. In fact, ironically, the same debate was had back in 2009-10. So we do have a track record, and we have a sense about the extent to which more and more renewable energy can be brought into the system, and that's what we how shall we say, that's what we're supporting. And the debate though is about whether this needs to be accelerated more, and in fact it borders in some instances on a predisposition against other options in our energy mix. For example, there's a sense that renewables could be used to displace nuclear altogether. And we're saying, we're not for or against any of these options. Let them, justify themselves.
And concerning the pace at which we are rolling out renewables, the recent OPEC deal will obviously have an impact on oil prices. They are trying to prop up oil prices there in the region, thus making renewable energy more attractive from a price proposition. Is there not room to perhaps roll out or increase the pace at which renewables is rolled out given the oil price scenario?
Yes, but we don't necessarily use oil in our energy mix. We use, I suppose, more natural gas and imported gas and so on. Right, so I suppose the point that you're making is that there is a linkage in relation to upward pressure in prices of fossil fuels like oil and so on, and that's what we're about. We're modeling that to see the extent to which there is a sweet spot, so to say, between the rollout of renewable energy as against very expensive electricity or other energy because of expensive input fossil fuels. And incidentally, we also say that it's not a one or the other, it's a mix, right? The interesting about renewable energy is that it tends to largely be so-called non-dispatchable. So in other words, you can't order the wind to blow, right? And it sharply brings into focus the need for us to introduce technologies like storage, right? And in the absence of storage, there is a certain point beyond which you're getting too much wind energy, and it's useless because it might blow, or it's useless to the extent that it might blow at the wrong point when you don't really need it, right? And how do you then arrest that? Because if it's attractive from a price point of view, you want to store it, right? Because it's literally harnessing, shall we say, cheap energy or free energy, right? So storage, becomes an imperative. Similarly, when the wind doesn't blow, currently, what options are out there for us? Use gas, because it complements it, right? So that's why we keep, going back to our starting point about trying to bring into a South African space an energy mix.
Tell us about some of the interest you've received from international players towards this drafted energy plan.
From a Southern African point of view, you can imagine that ESCOM South Africa dominates power generation, and we are seen as the, if you like, the entry point, we are the frontier into the SADC region and perhaps into Africa generally. So one of the ways of, I suppose, tackling this from their perspective relates to one of the policy aspirations and objectives that we espouse, which is that we want to see more and more regional integration. We'd like to be integrated more with our neighbors from an energy point of view. And this, the international community finds very attractive, because it's a way in terms of which they can, increase their participation in the Southern African development community.
Which international players specifically have expressed interest?
Look, it's everything from, everybody from the Far East, the Chinese, the Japanese, lots of European interest. And what is also interesting is the extent to which the interest can be categorized. I mean, there is an interest group focused largely on the renewable energy program, or the prospect around renewable energy and the continued use of renewable energy in South Africa and in the neighboring countries. But there's also a huge interest in the gas option that is in the integrated resource plan. Relative to our neighbors, there's lots of gas in South Africa itself, shale gas. We have a shale gas aspiration, coal-bed methane in Botswana and in South Africa as well, natural gas in Mozambique, and so on. And that creates some interest in relation to the possibilities around gas. Incidentally, I might also add, from a Department of Energy point of view, is that we will be launching a gas to power program, which seeks in the first window, if you like, in the initial stages, to import gas through what we call LNG, liquefied natural gas, and then ultimately pipeline infrastructure, and then ultimately our own indigenous gas in South Africa and in the region.
And when will this program be launched?
Look, we launched what we call the PIM, which is it's an information memorandum about the project, trying to indicate to prospective participants out there what the project is about and so on. This was in October this year, and we are due to launch the request for qualification very soon, very late this year, early in the new calendar year, late in the financial year.
All right. Now, you've spoken about some of the opportunities of the energy rollout for the African continent, specifically the SADC region. Can you tell us about any anticipated risks you see in strengthening the integration between continents, and how you may potentially deal with them?
To give you a sense, we have successfully, as a country, we've successfully traded electricity with Mozambique. You might be familiar with the Kahora-Bassa interconnector. At some point, the transmission line from Mozambique was interrupted by war, right? And that renders political risk has been, a very serious consideration. But I might also hasten to add that, over the past decades, literally, we've seen a lot of stability in the sub-region. So more and more it's becoming conducive for these cross-border transactions to be, put out there for investment and to increase the trade within the region. I need to also indicate that the economics around trading in the region is a bit of a tragedy, in the sense that there is a lot of demand in SADC for electricity and so on, but we just cannot get the countries to collaborate to bring the power to bear, so that the shortages, for example, in Zambia, Zimbabwe, and so on, there's a massive drought in SADC right now, and that shortage is being felt through the economies of these countries and so on. So how do we then create a situation of mutual survival, if you like, in terms of which, when we have excess, we can sell to them, and in some instances they can complement us as well, because they've got lots of clean energy options. Hydro is relatively clean. There's no greenhouse gas emissions of the same level that one can get out of coal. So those are the issues that drive, the reason why we want to trade. And therefore, commercially, I think the risks are low. Politically, the risks are being taken care of. There's political will for that to happen more and more. And then it's just a question of getting the investment going in that. And then obviously the issues, the detail about regulatory certainty and making sure that we have, a regulatory system that cuts across the various countries that are involved.
And are you having conversations with some of these economies in order to arrive at those solutions?
Yeah. I think it's literally all of them, all of our neighbors and more. The SADC countries, of the SADC countries out there, there's perhaps one or two that we haven't formulated and entered into an energy memorandum of understanding, as we call it.
So on to some of the contentious things that we spoke about, or you referred to earlier on in the interview. In terms of Eskom, now the current energy proposal has pushed back the need for nuclear some 21 years. Yet Eskom has said that it will continue to release bids for tender as soon as December for its nuclear program. What should we be making about this regarding relations between the department and Eskom?
Okay, so that's one of the reasons that we want to go out there and explain things, right? So maybe just to digress again a little bit, what we're saying is that we would like to take the opportunity to explain to the public what the integrated energy plan and the integrated resource plan process and its assumptions are about. So we're not at the point where we are pronouncing, for example, that nuclear needs to be delayed until 2037. That's not how you read the process, right? So there is a lot of, discourse out there about the fact that the department is saying we must postpone nuclear. We're saying that there are a number of scenarios that we're wanting to model. One of the things that people do not read into the base case assumptions that we have made is that we say, if we were to use a carbon budget methodology in terms of which greenhouse gas emissions are treated in a particularly, a prominent manner, right? Then what it does, it comes back to the point that you're making earlier. It puts a different spin on the use of coal, and it drives cleaner energy options more and more, right? Renewable energy, green, nuclear, clean, right? So the extent to which nuclear then plays a role is completely different to an approach which is based on a different consideration around greenhouse gas emissions, right? And we're saying that is a policy choice that we will make when we get to step number 4. But in the meantime, we're wanting to demonstrate that we've looked at this one possibility, right? On the one extreme, it's one in terms of which we're saying, let's drive the renewables more and more, and let's see the extent to which we can use renewable energy in order to meet our electricity demand. On the other extreme, we're saying, let's look at those possibilities in terms of which we would like to reduce our greenhouse emissions as aggressively as we can. And therefore, the nuclear option kicks in. And the issue that we've always, premised our arguments on is the fact that we recognize that there's a question around pace and scale, but we don't have any predisposition against nuclear. In fact, what the public consultation process seeks to do is to demonstrate out there what would happen. We have a scenario in terms of which we're bringing in about 100,000 megawatts of wind and 50,000 megawatts of solar in the period up to 2050. And we say, for one to have what we refer to as system adequacy, in other words, no blackouts in relation to this option, right? The extent to which it has implications on the electricity grid, on the electricity network, has to be modeled as well. Because it is very easy on paper to try and build 105,000 megawatts of wind in the period up to 2050. But there are other considerations that kick in. So practically, right, we need to be able to say these are the implications of the grid, because currently, just to give you a sense, in the Northern Cape, right, there's something called the Northern Cape Ring, which is already constrained. So the extent to which you can keep on connecting PV projects into the Northern Cape, where we have the best, solar resource in this country, right? That possibility is constrained, right? So you can't talk about that out of context with what is happening in the grid. And at what pace do we then need to build the grid up in order to be able to evacuate all of this power from the renewable energy options out there? So, all of these things is what we want to explain, right? And we're not saying we want to explain and move off. I mean, that's the one other criticism that we're facing at the moment, where there is a sense that we're trying to rush this. We say, no, you've got until March next year. But in the meantime, we are availing ourselves, even in the period right up to the 15th of December, right, for those that are available, that we can explain. Right? It's not like we're saying, please go read this document and then come back to us by the 15th. And so we're saying we're availing ourselves to explain these things through a number of, processes, be it, road shows. We have a dedicated portal on our website that, disseminates information about this whole thing. We have community participation programs to try and get more and more people, au fait with this process. And
so should Eskom actually go ahead with its nuclear bidding process in December? You're saying that you'll stand back as the Department of Energy?
What we're saying is that we understand Eskom to be saying that they would like to get ready, right? So if one listens carefully to what Eskom is saying, right, I don't think they're saying they would like to make a commitment by the end of this year, right? They're saying whilst this process is unfolding, right, they need to get ready because there is a range of possibilities. If we go carbon budgets, for example, right, we might need the nuclear option sooner than the next decade, right? So when I say the next decade, I mean after 2030. So we might need it any time between 2026 up to 2030, right, which is earlier than if we say we're not going for that particular policy choice, right, and we might then have to go for the nuclear option much later, in the next decade following this coming one, right? And all of those things are also contingent on a whole host of issues. One, I've mentioned the issue around, this being a policy, a prerogative of government, right? But secondly, there are those practical considerations, right, in relation to, amongst others, how do you finance this program? Right, so all of those things have to be resolved before one finally pushes the button to say, and therefore I believe that from an Eskom point of view, right, because Eskom is the designated owner-operator of the nuclear plants, right, I think there's nothing wrong with them getting ready in terms of, preparing themselves for this program or the possibility that it could be faster or slower.
And on the issue of financing, how will government go about financing nuclear? It's quite an expensive build.
Right, so we will give an indication in relative terms of what each of these scenarios could possibly mean in terms of an electricity tariff trajectory into the future, right? And obviously we understand, government is sympathetic to the fact that, you can't have tariffs going through, steep increases every year. There is this, the sense that, tariffs cannot carry on increasing like that. And tariffs is, I suppose, the only way that Eskom derives revenue to be able to service the debt and to build, new power stations, meet their operational costs, and so on. So side by side with tariff, there is a consideration around the extent to which government could help Eskom to be able to, to finance, the program. And those are the things that we need to go through as part of the process of coming to the final decision on this.
And what's your response to the safety concerns, particularly for communities around nuclear?
Fortunately, in this country, we have a track record since 1985 with Kubek Power Station, right? So go check on the safety record of Kubek Power Station. You with me? So it doesn't make us complacent, right? Safety in the context of Fukushima, it's a very emotive thing, as I said. It's more like people just want to hear that it was a nuclear power station, it was an accident. People forget that it was a tsunami, right? And therefore, how did this nuclear power station, perform under those stressed conditions? That becomes an issue that we need to educate the public around. But having said all of that, it is a massive consideration on the part of government to make sure that we do not expose South Africans to unnecessary, shall we say, safety and health risk.
When the energy plan gets rolled out, how will you go about ensuring that there's transparency and it's done in a manner which solicits trust from the public?
Well, I suppose this is exactly what we're trying to do with this process, right? Starting with the plan itself, right? We want to demystify the plan, right? We want to get the public more and more familiar with the planning process. I mean, this point about we've already made the decision, this is the IRP. I mean, that's very fascinating because our challenge is to make the public understand that actually we're only starting. We haven't concluded yet, right? So that's the one thing that we would like to achieve through this process, to build confidence around public participation, transparency, as required in terms of our constitution. So we would like to, dispel any of these myths about we're hiding this and we're hiding the other. Yeah, I mean, in regard to the issue around transparency vis-a-vis the procurement process, there is not a better starting point than a requirement in the law, in the Constitution and in the Public Finance Management Act, that our processes must be, fair, equitable, transparent, competitive and cost-effective, right? And I believe we would be flouting the law if we did not follow the prescripts of the law in our procurement process. But having said that, over and above that, we have a track record, and I alluded to the Renewable Energy IPP process, where we have demonstrated that, government, through public procurement, can still run a transparent, competitive, cost-effective, a bidding process without any funny business going on. And we believe that that is the way that we will implement this integrated resource plan going forward.